They spent hundreds of millions building the world's smartest AI, but it was a cafe girl with an apron and a notebook who whispered the fix no engineer could see. Morning in the valley carried its own rhythm, the sharp tap of leather shoes on pavement, the hiss of glass doors sliding open, and the ceaseless stream of people clutching laptops, as if the future itself depended on their coding speed. In the shadow of all this steel and glass stood a modest corner cafe called Solstice Café. No glowing neon sign, no trendy franchise brand, just a faded wooden door, a wall streaked with age, and the warm scent of hand-roasted beans that greeted every passerby like an embrace. Few people ever met the owner. The cafe's heart and hands belonged to Elena Rivera, a 20-year-old barista with a slight frame, hair tied back neatly, and brown eyes that carried depths far older than her years. Customers knew her as quick, quiet, and almost invisible behind the counter. Yet beneath the plain apron, Elena carried a secret larger than the cafe itself, a battered notebook, its edges worn, its pages filled with strange equations and half-legible notes. That notebook was her hidden ritual. As she served cappuccinos and lattes, she listened, not to idle chatter, but to fragments of technical conversations tossed carelessly into the air. For across the street towered the headquarters of the most ambitious AI company in Silicon Valley, the Guardians of Ethermind, a $500 million experiment in artificial intelligence. Each day, engineers, researchers, and executives slipped into Solstice for caffeine, and along with their coffee, they spilled words that were not meant for her. Elena had never made it to college. Her father had died in a construction accident, forcing her to put dreams of studying mathematics aside. Her mother, frail with congenital heart disease, needed expensive medication. Elena's days split in two, daylight hours behind the espresso machine, evenings by her mother's bedside in their cramped apartment. When her mother finally drifted to sleep, Elena opened the notebook, replaying every word she'd overheard, cross-referencing with second-hand textbooks bought from thrift stores. "Matrix," she whispered one night, tracing her finger across the page. To her, a matrix was not an abstract block of numbers. It was a chessboard, infinite and alive, where each move revealed hidden patterns. Thus, Solstice Café became both her workplace and her secret lecture hall. Amid the hum of laptops and the whir of grinders, she gathered shards of knowledge like pieces of broken glass, hoping one day they would form a window to something greater. On rainy mornings, she would hear an engineer sigh, "Gradient descent again. The model's stuck in a local minimum." While pouring coffee, Elena pictured a marble rolling across foggy hills, forever trapped in a shallow valley instead of reaching the lowest point. That night, she sketched the hills in her notebook, writing beneath them, "Local minimum equals the trap of the algorithm." Sometimes she sat at her mother's bedside, whispering, "I'll find a way. Someday, I'll use this knowledge to heal you, or at least to keep Father's dream alive." For her father had once drawn numbers in the dust of their poor hometown, showing her the grace of parabolas and the dignity of circles. He had believed she was gifted. That belief lingered like a lantern flame in the dark. Now, in Silicon Valley, Elena had no lecture halls, no professors, only overheard fragments and her own stubborn patience. To the customers rushing through, Solstice Café was nothing more than a caffeine stop before the real battles of code and capital. They never noticed the barista listening, translating their jargon into sketches and symbols. Occasionally, Elena looked up at the gleaming fortress of glass across the street. It stood proud, impregnable, a citadel of intellect. Yet she knew that even the tallest fortress bore cracks invisible to those inside. And sometimes, it was the quiet observer on the outside who saw them first. There were rare moments of calm, Steam rising from fresh espresso, sunlight spilling through the window, Elena wiping down the counter. She would open the notebook, reading her uneven scrawls. Backpropagation equals sending errors backward. Activation function equals the key that unlocks a neuron. To the engineers, these were basics. To Elena, they were distant mountains. Still, she was unafraid to climb. For in her heart she held one unshakable conviction. Knowledge does not ask where you come from. It does not demand wealth or pedigree. Knowledge only asks for patience, loyalty, and a fire that will not go out. And so, in that unremarkable cafe, on an afternoon like any other, destiny quietly set the stage for an unlikely collision. A struggling barista and a $500 million machine intelligence faltering under its own weight. Elena did not yet know it, but her worn notebook was about to become the key to a door no engineer could open. The cafe's hum was its own kind of symphony. Steam hissed, porcelain cups clinked, keyboards tapped. Yet for Elena, the true music was in the fragments of speech that slipped between sips of cappuccino and hurried footsteps. Every morning, a cluster of engineers claimed the corner table. They spoke in a language that to most sounded like static. Tensor dimensions, overfitting, vanishing gradients. Customers nearby would drown it out with earbuds or small talk. But Elena leaned inward, her hands steadying a pitcher of milk, her mind capturing each syllable like a fisherman netting scattered silver fish. She would jot notes in her battered book between orders, pages filled with phrases, neural nets, layers of nodes connected. Overfitting equals model memorizes, forgets to generalize. Data equals fuel, but messy fuel can break the engine. To her, they weren't just technical complaints. They were riddles, and riddles demanded answers. That night, at her kitchen table, Elena replayed the fragments, neural networks. She drew circles in columns, connecting them with arrows. The picture resembled the lights of her mother's heart monitor, each pulse depending on the one before it. She whispered, "So each node takes in numbers, mixes them, and passes them forward." Her mother stirred in the bedroom, coughing. Elena waited until the sound eased, then wrote another line. But if the input is tangled, even the best network will choke. The next day, a young engineer slammed his cup down and muttered, "The whole model collapsed again. Training data's a mess." His colleague added, "We can't even align half the sources. Different formats, different scales." Elena felt a spark in her chest. She thought of recipes, how her father used to say flour and salt and yeast must be measured, sifted, balanced. "Normalize before you bake," he had laughed. And here, in this cafe, the engineers were baking without measuring. Her pen scratched the page. Normalization equals subtract mean, divide by spread. Bring all values into harmony. She drew a loaf of bread beside the formula, smiling faintly at her own metaphor. That night she tested her thought. With a second-hand calculator, she took a small list of numbers from an old statistics book. 50, 60, 70, 200. She computed the average, subtracted it, then divided by the variation. Suddenly, the numbers stood side by side in neat proportion, no longer drowning one another. "It's like tuning instruments before an orchestra," she murmured. "If one plays too loud, the whole song breaks." The following week, the engineers' voices rose with more frustration. $500 million and the thing still crashes every 12 hours, one said bitterly. "It keeps confusing contradictory inputs." Another shook his head. "We tried patching the architecture, but the flaw runs deeper." Elena's fingers tightened around the cup she was serving. In her notebook, she had already begun tracing a pattern. Each time they complained, it led back to the same wound, unruly, inconsistent data. For them, it was noise. For her, it was a melody with a missing note. And though she never spoke a word aloud, Her eyes flickered with the quiet certainty of someone beginning to see the outline of a puzzle too vast for others to notice. The fortress across the street was faltering, and in the shadows of its failure, a cafe girl was gathering the fragments, stitching them into clarity. The morning began with tension you could almost taste in the air. Elena had just finished steaming milk for a cappuccino when the front door banged open harder than usual. A group of engineers filed in, their voices sharp, their steps clipped. They didn't order right away. Instead, they dropped their bags at the corner table and dove into argument as though the cafe itself were their war room. "The system crashed again," one barked. "We lost another 12 hours of training." "Same corrupted loops," another replied. "The outputs contradict themselves because the inputs are garbage." "Don't tell me it's garbage data again," a third engineer muttered, rubbing his eyes. "We've patched the code 10 times. Architecture, backpropagation tweaks, regularization. None of it matters when the foundation is unstable." Elena carried their coffees over in silence. She set the cups down, careful not to interrupt. But every syllable slid into her ears and lodged itself deep. Corrupted loops, contradictory inputs, garbage data. She returned to the counter, her heart quickening. In her mind's eye, she saw a castle built on sand. Towers of elegant algorithms swaying no matter how many times you reinforced them, because the ground beneath shifted wildly. Back at the register, she pulled her notebook from under the counter and wrote in slanted script, "The input must be made consistent before the machine can learn. Normalize first." Her pencil hovered, then she drew a simple line. Numbers scattered wildly across a page, and beneath them, the same numbers centered and aligned. Beneath the sketch, she added, "Bring them into the same language before asking them to speak together." Across the cafe, voices rose. "$500 million and we're babysitting a toddler that can't tell day from night," one engineer spat. "Maybe we need more data," another suggested weakly. "No," said the first, shaking his head. "It's not quantity, it's quality. We can't keep feeding it noise." Elena's gaze flickered toward them. Her father's words returned like an echo from years past. "Measure your ingredients, Elena. You can't bake bread if the flour is clumped and the yeast is scattered." She pressed her lips together. The engineers were brilliant, no doubt, but brilliance could blind. They were staring at the ceiling of their fortress, patching cracks overhead, while the foundation rotted below. The rest of the day passed in a blur of orders. Macchiatos, Americanos, flat whites. Elena's hands worked, but her mind spun around one realization. Their fortress of AI was not unbreakable. She had glimpsed the crack. That evening, after her mother fell asleep, Elena sat at the small kitchen table with the notebook open and the lamplight spilling across the page. She wrote slowly, deliberately. If input data is inconsistent, the network cannot converge. Solution: pre-processing. Subtract the mean. Divide by the spread. Align scales. Then, learning can begin. She paused, tapping her pencil. Converge. She remembered the term from a statistics book, the process of a model settling into a stable pattern. Without harmony at the start, no amount of correction at the end would matter. She sketched again. A violin section tuning before a symphony. One instrument sharp, another flat, the whole performance discordant. Then, after tuning, a single note resonating through the hall. Her throat tightened. She whispered into the quiet apartment, "They don't see it yet." But the crack is right there. Through the window, the lights of the AI headquarters burned like a citadel across the night sky. A citadel that, to its own builders, seemed indestructible. But Elena, a girl in a worn apron with a fading notebook, had seen the truth. Sometimes the smallest fracture was all it took to topple even the grandest design. And so she kept writing, quiet, steady strokes of pencil on paper, as if she were not merely taking notes, but laying bricks for a bridge only she could see. Tomorrow, the fortress would keep arguing. But tonight, Elena held the first clear map of its weakness. It was late. The cafe was almost empty, save for the soft hum of the espresso machine and the faint glow of laptops left behind by hurried engineers. Elena wiped the counter slowly, her mind heavy with the echoes of the day's arguments. The fortress across the street seemed restless, its problems leaking into her small shop like storm water through cracks in a roof. She noticed one of the engineers, a young man with glasses perpetually slipping down his nose, had left in a rush. His laptop still glowed faintly on the corner table. She didn't dare touch it, but a single screen had been left open long enough for her to catch a glimpse. Rows of numbers, layers of code, graphs trembling like unstable bridges. Elena's chest tightened. She recognized the chaos. It was the same disharmony she had scribbled about in her notebook, data sets colliding like instruments playing out of tune. She returned to the counter, set down her rag, and pulled a pen from her apron. With no paper nearby, she reached for the nearest thing, a clean napkin. Her hand trembled, but she began to write. First, she drew a column of scattered numbers, 5, 50, 500. Then, beside it, a simple formula written in words. Take each value, subtract the average, then divide by the standard deviation. She whispered under her breath, tune them before they play together. She drew a small arrow leading to a new column. Numbers balanced around 0, no longer drowning one another. What had once been chaos now hummed with quiet order. At that moment, the bell above the cafe door jingled. A customer, not an engineer, just a man grabbing a late espresso, paused at the counter and caught sight of her napkin. He tilted his head. That looks like math. Complicated math. Who taught you that? Elena flushed, instinctively sliding the napkin closer to her. No one. I just listen sometimes. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. Most people listen to music. You listen to equations. She smiled faintly, but her heart pounded. She wasn't supposed to be writing formulas at work. She wasn't supposed to understand any of this, yet here she was, a barista with tired eyes and an old notebook, daring to put order to the chaos that brilliant minds across the street had not yet tamed. When the customer left, Elena stared at the napkin a long while. It was such a small thing, flimsy, easy to tear, destined for the trash. And yet, on its thin surface lay an idea sturdy enough to support a collapsing machine worth hundreds of millions. She folded it once, carefully, and slipped it into her notebook. She didn't know it yet, but that napkin would not remain hidden for long. For the fortress across the street was desperate, and sometimes desperation has a way of discovering the quietest secrets. The morning after her quiet scribbles, Solstice Café was fuller than usual. The air buzzed with the nervous chatter of engineers. Elena brewed coffee as always, her apron slightly damp with steam, her eyes drifting toward the corner table. A young engineer she recognized, the one with glasses who had left his laptop behind, rushed in, holding a crumpled napkin. Her napkin. He dropped into a chair, spreading it flat against the table. The ink was smudged but still legible. His colleagues leaned in. "Where did you get this?" one of them asked. "I found it here last night," he said breathlessly. "Look, it's normalization. Subtract the average, divide by the spread. Clean the inputs before feeding them into the net." The others stared at him, then at the napkin. "You tested it?" He nodded. "I ran it on a subset of our data." The system held steady for 12 hours straight. 12. That's the longest uptime we've ever had. A silence followed. Then, as if a dam had broken, voices tumbled over one another. "Impossible. We've tried a dozen pre-processing tricks." but none this simple. It can't be from one of us. Who even wrote it? Their words carried across the cafe, low but urgent. Elena froze mid-pour, her hand steady though her heartbeat raced. She dared not look their way, yet every word struck her like thunder. A napkin. Just a napkin. She had meant it for herself, nothing more. Across the room, one of the engineers pressed a palm to his forehead. Think about it. If someone left this here, they must have overheard us. Someone outside the lab. The idea unsettled them. Their fortress was sealed tight, guarded by contracts and secrets. And yet, a stranger had reached into its heart and whispered the fix they could not find. The glasses-wearing engineer folded the napkin carefully, as if it were a sacred text. I don't care who wrote it. All I know is it works. And we need it. Elena turned to the sink, washing cups to hide her face. The clinking porcelain nearly covered the pounding of her pulse. By noon, the engineers had left, napkin in hand, voices urgent as they hurried back to the fortress across the street. Elena stood at the counter, staring at the empty table. She pressed her palm against her apron pocket where her notebook rested. For the first time, fear crept in. She had lived in the shadows, learning quietly, hidden, but now her shadow had reached into their world. She whispered to herself, "They will come looking." And she was right. For in the fortress, the miracle of 12 steady hours had already begun to spread like wildfire. The cafe was quieter than usual that morning, but the silence was heavy, not peaceful. Elena felt it before she saw him, a presence unlike the engineers who came in with their laptops and restless chatter. The man who stepped through the door did not rush. He moved with the certainty of someone who had already decided what he wanted. His suit was sharp, but understated. His hair touched with silver, and his eyes carried the weight of years in the valley's storms. Elena had seen him once before. Across the street in the headlines taped to a newsstand, Chief Technology Officer of Ethermind. He approached the counter. Elena kept her gaze down, polishing a cup, willing her hands not to tremble. "Coffee," he said simply. His voice was calm, but underneath it was something else, the tone of a man circling a truth. "Yes, sir," Elena answered, keeping her voice low. She moved to the machine, grinding beans, frothing milk. The motions were muscle memory, yet her chest tightened with each second he lingered. When she slid the cup across the counter, he did not reach for it. He studied her instead. "You've been listening," he said at last. Her throat closed. "Listening?" she repeated, feigning confusion. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "The napkin. The formula. That was not one of my engineers." Elena froze. The hiss of the machine filled the silence between them. She could have denied it. She could have laughed, pretended she had no idea what he meant. But the weight of his gaze was steady, unyielding. He had built systems that uncovered patterns in oceans of data. He could surely recognize the tremor in a barista's hand. Her voice cracked. She set the cup down and clasped her hands together. "I didn't mean for anyone to see it." The CTO's brow furrowed. "Then why write it?" Elena swallowed hard. "Because it was true. The data wasn't aligned." It was like asking a choir to sing without tuning their instruments. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, then curiosity. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Her answer was almost a whisper. "Old textbooks, whatever I could find. And I listen to what your engineers talk about." She dared glance up, then lowered her eyes again. "That's all." He studied her a long moment, as though measuring the distance between a half-truth and a confession. "You've never studied computer science formally?" She shook her head. I never had the chance. And yet you wrote a fix my entire team overlooked. His tone was not accusing now, but wondering. Still, the weight of his presence pressed down on her. I only saw a pattern, Elena murmured. That's all I do. I look for patterns. For the first time, the CTO reached for his coffee. He lifted it, sipped, and set it down carefully, as if tasting more than the drink itself. You realize, he said quietly, what you've done is not ordinary. Elena folded her arms across her apron, more shield than comfort. I didn't do anything. I just wrote on a napkin. He almost smiled. Sometimes the greatest revolutions start that way. From a nearby table, the engineers watched. Whispers passed between them. It's her. The barista. She knew. Elena felt their eyes burn on her back. She wanted to retreat, to disappear into the clatter of cups and steam. But the CTO's voice anchored her. Come with me, he said. Her head snapped up. Excuse me? Come to the lab, he repeated. If you can see what my team cannot, then I need to see what you see. Elena shook her head quickly. No, I can't. I only make coffee. I take care of my mother. I'm not one of you. His gaze softened slightly. You are not one of us, no. But perhaps that is why you saw what we could not. Her hands tightened on the counter. She thought of her mother, frail and sleeping in their small apartment. She thought of her father, sketching circles in the dust. She thought of the notebook in her apron pocket, filled with scribbles no one else had ever read. I don't belong there, she said at last. The CTO did not argue. He finished his coffee, placed the cup down, and stood. But before he turned to leave, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. Whether you step into the lab or not, remember this: genius is not confined by titles. Sometimes it wears an apron. And then he was gone, the bell above the door chiming softly in his wake. Elena stood frozen, staring at the empty cup he had left behind. A part of her longed to retreat into the safety of anonymity. But another part, a small, fierce flame, burned brighter than ever. For the fortress across the street had opened its gate, if only a crack. And now the question was whether she would dare to walk through. The invitation came not as a letter or contract, but as a quiet request. Come tomorrow, just to see. Elena hesitated all night. She sat at the small kitchen table beside her sleeping mother, notebook open, lamp flickering weakly. On one page she had written kitchen, on the other, lab. Two worlds, both demanding. One filled with the warmth of coffee steam, the other with cold light from servers stacked like towers. By morning, she found herself walking across the street. Her apron was folded in her bag, replaced by a plain shirt and jeans. She felt exposed, as though stepping out of her skin. The headquarters of Ethermind rose above her like glass cliffs. Inside, the air was sterile, humming with hidden machines. Security badges flashed at every turn. Elena followed the CTO down bright corridors until they stopped before a heavy door. Here, he said simply. The door slid open, and for a moment Elena forgot to breathe. The lab was unlike anything she had imagined. Rows of screens glowed with streams of numbers. Server racks stretched like black pillars, their tiny lights blinking red, amber, green, a forest of silent signals. The air was cool, almost metallic, vibrating with the steady thrum of processors. But more than the machines, it was the people. Engineers crowded around monitors, eyes tired, voices tense. Some turned to glance at her. Their stares were sharp, curious, skeptical. One smirked. Is this the coffee girl? Another whispered, not quietly enough. What is she doing here? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to fold into herself, to vanish. She had no badge, no degree, no right. Only a notebook with smudged handwriting and a single napkin that had shaken their fortress. The CTO spoke firmly. She sees patterns. That's why she's here. Some engineers scoffed. One leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Patterns? We've been staring at these for months. Elena lowered her eyes, clutching her notebook tight against her chest. The CTO guided her toward a central console. On the main screen, red error logs cascaded endlessly, like rainfall that refused to stop. Ethermind was crashing again. Look, he said. Elena stepped closer. The numbers scrolled too quickly to follow, but she felt the rhythm of their collapse. Repetition, contradiction, imbalance, like dough kneaded without flour, collapsing under its own weight. An engineer muttered, "We've patched it 12 times, adjusted the architecture, added layers, tweaked learning rates. It always falls apart." Because, Elena said softly, almost to herself, you're trying to fix the ceiling while the floor keeps shifting. Heads turned. What did you say? One asked. She steadied her voice. It's not about more layers or faster processors. It's about teaching the system to learn from its own mistakes. The room went still. She opened her notebook, flipping to a page where she had drawn arrows looping backward into themselves. Every time the model fails, don't hide it. Don't patch over it. Let it remember. Let it adjust using the very errors it creates. One engineer frowned. That's reinforcement learning. Elena shook her head. Not exactly. Reinforcement rewards success. I mean, feed it the failures themselves. Let it build a memory of its own cracks. It's like bread dough. It collapses once, twice. But each time you adjust the flour, the water, until it holds. You don't ignore the collapse. You use it. Her voice faltered at the end, unsure if she had said too much. Silence hung heavy. Then laughter, sharp, dismissive. Coffee girl thinks she can rewrite machine learning with baking metaphors. Another added, this is a waste of time. The CTO raised his hand. The room fell quiet. He looked at Elena, then at the endless stream of red errors on the screen. Try it, he said. The skeptics groaned, but a few, weary enough from months of failure, obeyed. Fingers flew across keyboards. Code shifted. New lines appeared. Elena stood back, clutching her notebook, her heart racing. She knew it might fail, but deep inside, a flame told her this was the path. On the screen, the red errors continued, then slowed. For a heartbeat, they seemed to pause. The engineers held their breath. Then suddenly a burst of green logs scrolled down. The system had caught its own mistake, adjusted, and continued forward. The room erupted, not in cheers but in stunned silence. Engineers stared at one another, eyes wide. The CTO's lips curved into the faintest smile. Elena exhaled, her shoulders trembling. She was still just a girl from a cafe, still just a daughter watching over her sick mother. And yet for this moment, in this cold room of servers and skeptics, her voice had carried. She didn't know if they would accept her. She didn't know if tomorrow the fortress would close its gates again. But tonight, she had stepped through, and the kitchen, for once, felt not so far from the lab. The lab was nearly deserted by nightfall. Most of the engineers had gone home, their eyes hollow after another day of failures. Only a skeleton crew remained, slumped at their stations, bathed in the glow of error logs that bled red across every screen. Elena sat quietly in the corner, notebook on her lap. She hadn't meant to stay this late. But the CTO had asked her to remain, his voice calm yet insistent. Stay, watch, tell us what you see. The hum of the servers filled the silence. It was not the warm hum of a coffee grinder in Solstice Café, but something deeper, a vibration that seemed to come from the bones of the building itself. The fortress was alive, but in pain. On the central console, the red lines marched downward like an endless funeral procession. Segmentation fault. Memory overflow. Training halted. An engineer muttered under his breath, "It's hopeless. We'll just reset again in the morning." He turned to pack up, but the CTO stopped him with a glance. Then he looked at Elena. "Do you see the pattern?" he asked, softly. Elena hesitated. The errors were scrolling too fast to read, yet she felt their rhythm. A stutter, a loop, a collapse. Like dough rising too quickly, then falling flat. She opened her notebook, flipping to the page she had scribbled that afternoon. "Let the system learn from its failures." Her hand shook as she stood. "I think you're ignoring the story the errors are telling." One of the engineers scoffed. "Errors are garbage. They don't teach anything." But the CTO nodded toward the keyboard. "Show us." Elena froze. "Me?" "Yes." Her throat tightened. She wasn't a coder. Not really. She had copied syntax from textbooks, run small scripts on a borrowed laptop years ago. But never like this. Never on machines worth millions, in a room where one wrong keystroke could undo weeks of work. Still, she stepped forward. Her reflection trembled on the black glass of the console. She rested her notebook on the desk, its pages smudged from coffee stains and sleepless nights. "Every time the system fails," she began slowly, "it tries again as if nothing happened. That's like a child falling, forgetting the pain, and tripping over the same stone tomorrow. But if you let the child remember the bruise, the next step changes." The engineer at her side rolled his eyes, but another, younger one leaned forward, curious. Elena took a breath, then typed. Her fingers hesitated, then moved more surely. "Capture error logs, store them, feed them back as input adjustments on the next run." It wasn't elegant code. She borrowed snippets she remembered, stitched them together with instinct more than certainty. But it formed a loop, one that told the machine, "Your failures are not trash. They are lessons." When she hit enter, the room seemed to exhale. For a moment, nothing changed. The red errors continued, relentless. Elena's pulse hammered in her ears. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe she had broken it further. Then the stream slowed. A line of green appeared. Another followed. The errors did not vanish, but instead of halting, the system adjusted. Where it once stumbled, it now shifted. Recalibrated, pressed forward. The red shrank, the green grew. On the main monitor, graphs that had always spiked and crashed began to smooth. Curves leveled into steady slopes. The young engineer whispered, "It's stabilizing." No one moved. The only sound was the steady whir of the servers, the lifeblood of the fortress. Minutes passed, then an hour. The system held. Finally, the CTO broke the silence. His voice was low, almost reverent. "She did it." Elena stepped back, her legs weak. She pressed her notebook against her chest, as though to steady her heartbeat. The engineers stared, some in awe, others in disbelief, a few still unwilling to accept what they had seen. But none could deny the truth on the screen. Their $500 million project, which had crumbled again and again, now stood firm under the guidance of a barista with an old notebook. Elena closed her eyes. For once, the fortress across the street no longer felt untouchable. It had cracks. Yes, but also doors. And she, apron girl, had walked through one. Outside, midnight settled over Silicon Valley. Streetlights flickered. The world beyond the glass walls slept. But inside the lab, something had awakened. And Elena, though she would never admit it aloud, had witnessed a miracle born not of power or money, but of listening, patience, and a napkin's worth of courage. By dawn, the secret was no longer a secret. What had begun as a quiet fix in the middle of the night spread through the halls of Ethermind like wildfire. Engineers who had doubted now whispered in awe. The system that once collapsed after hours was running steadily, adapting, learning. On whiteboards, someone had scrawled in large letters, "The napkin fix." By noon, rumors had escaped the fortress walls. A journalist who had contacts in the company caught wind of it. Within hours, the story appeared on a tech blog. Mystery outsider saves $500 AI project. By evening, the headlines multiplied. Not an engineer, not a PhD, a barista. The girl with the napkin algorithm. Genius wears an apron. On social media, the story erupted. Some laughed in admiration. Others bristled at the idea that years of doctoral work could be outshone by someone pouring lattes. Memes spread, pictures of coffee cups with code written in foam, slogans like "caffeinate your neural net." But inside Ethermind, laughter was scarce. The executives gathered in a glass-walled boardroom, blinds drawn tight. Elena's name was on their lips. "We cannot allow this to define us," one said sharply. "Do you realize how humiliating it is? $500 million spent, and the breakthrough comes from a cafe across the street?" "She's a liability," another added. "If she talks, if she claims ownership..." The CTO cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "She's not a liability. She's the reason this project is alive." The room fell silent. The CTO's loyalty to Elena was no longer in doubt. But his colleagues were not so easily swayed. Meanwhile, Elena sat in her tiny apartment, the glow of her phone lighting the dark. She scrolled through the storm, strangers praising her, doubting her, mocking her, idolizing her. She saw her own face in a blurry photo someone had snapped through the cafe window. Her hands trembled as she turned the screen off. Her mother, half awake, asked softly, "What's wrong, mija?" Elena forced a smile. "Nothing, Mama. Just noise." But inside, the noise was deafening. The next morning, Solstice Café was no longer quiet. A line stretched out the door, not for coffee, but for a glimpse of the girl who had saved the machine. Reporters held microphones, cameras clicked, customers whispered, pointing. "Elena Rivera," one called. "How did you do it?" Another pushed forward. "Do you plan to join Ethermind officially?" Elena kept her head down, steaming milk, pouring coffee. Her hands shook, but her motions stayed steady. She wanted nothing more than to return to the silence of her notebook, to the evenings of sketching equations by lamplight. But the world had found her, and it would not look away. Across the street, the fortress itself was divided. Some engineers now approached her with quiet respect, slipping into the cafe to thank her. Others looked at her with resentment, as though her very existence mocked their years of training. In the boardroom, the debate sharpened. "If we announce her as part of the team," one executive argued, "we admit we couldn't solve this ourselves." "And if we bury her contribution," another countered, "we risk the story leaking further, and then we look like thieves." The CTO sat in silence for a long moment, then spoke with finality. "You can't erase truth with contracts. She's already out there." The storm raged on. Elena, caught in its center, clung to the one thing that had never betrayed her, her notebook. She opened it late that night, the city lights flickering through the window, and wrote a single line, "They see scandal, I see music." For to her, the chaos was still just patterns, waiting to be understood. But she also knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whether the fortress embraced her or rejected her, she would not let it define her. The napkin was never about glory. It was about listening, learning, and keeping a promise to herself and to her family. And as the valley's storm gathered louder outside, Elena's quiet conviction only deepened. The next move would be hers. The storm burned for weeks. Reporters camped outside Solstice Café. Engineers whispered her name like a half-myth. Executives argued in circles behind closed doors. The world waited to see what the barista would do. The offer came on a crisp white envelope embossed with the Ethermind seal. Inside, a contract, a salary larger than Elena could ever imagine. Benefits, prestige, a chance to walk through the fortress gates as one of them. She read it once, twice. Her hands did not shake. Not this time. She set the contract aside. That evening, she brewed tea for her mother, sitting quietly as the old heart monitor pulsed gently in the background. Her mother's voice was weak, but steady.
"Mija," she whispered, "they want you. Isn't this your chance?"
Elena looked down at her notebook, resting on the kitchen table. Its pages were filled with years of scribbles, doodles, half-formed ideas. None of them had ever been meant for glory. They were meant for learning, for survival, for love. She smiled faintly. "I don't need their badge, Mama. I already know who I am." The next morning, she returned the envelope. Politely, quietly, refused the contract. The executives were stunned. Some relieved, others furious. But the CTO, the only one who had truly seen her, simply nodded, a small, knowing smile in his eyes. Days later, the storm began to calm. Headlines shifted. The valley found a new obsession. But Elena's story lingered in whispers. The girl with the napkin who turned away from the fortress. With the money she had been offered as a reward, not as salary, but as gratitude, Elena paid her mother's medical bills. The doctor stabilized her condition, giving her the breath of life she had long needed. For Elena, that alone was enough. But she did not stop there. In a small community center on the edge of town, Elena rented a room with chipped paint and flickering lights. She bought second-hand laptops, a whiteboard, a box of notebooks. She hung a handwritten sign above the door. Free coding lessons. All welcome. The first week, only 3 children came, sons and daughters of janitors, grocery clerks, delivery drivers. They looked at her shyly, unsure if they belonged. Elena smiled and set cups of cocoa before them. "You belong," she said simply. She taught them the way she had taught herself, with metaphors, with patience, with drawings that turned algorithms into stories. A neural net became a row of friends passing secrets down a line. Data normalization became tuning instruments before a song. Errors became bruises that taught you how to walk stronger. By the 3rd week, 10 students came, then 20, then more. They brought siblings, cousins, neighbors. Soon the room was overflowing with children scribbling equations in battered notebooks, their eyes shining with the same fire that had once burned in hers. One evening, as the sun set, Elena stood at the back of the classroom watching them. Her mother sat beside her, bundled in a shawl, smiling through tired eyes.
"Mija," she said softly, "this is your real invention."
Elena nodded, for the fortress had its AI. But here was her legacy. Not a machine worth millions, but young lives discovering that genius could come from anywhere. Back at Solstice Café, life resumed its rhythm. The morning rush, the hiss of steam, the clink of porcelain. Elena still worked the counter some days, apron tied neat, her notebook tucked close. Customers came not for headlines anymore, but for coffee. And sometimes, for the quiet barista who once outsmarted the valley's brightest minds. On the wall above the counter, instead of a corporate business card, hung her new one. Elena Rivera, Barista. Teacher. Listener of patterns. And if a stranger asked about the napkin, she would smile and say, "It wasn't about fixing a machine. It was about hearing the music hidden in the noise." The story closed not with thunder, but with warmth. A daughter by her mother's side, a classroom filled with children's laughter, a cafe that smelled of coffee and hope. The message lingered like the last sip of a drink shared slowly. Genius can wear an apron. And sometimes, the world changes not with a grand speech, but with a note scribbled on a napkin. This story has come to an end, yet its echo still lingers. In a world filled with machines and numbers, we were reminded of something simple. Genius does not ask who you are or where you come from. It only asks for a patient heart and hands willing to keep trying. Thank you for sitting with me, as if by a fireplace, to hear about a young woman in an apron who dared to offer an answer to an entire valley. If this story has warmed you, I invite you to subscribe, not for me alone, but for the many untold stories still waiting, of the janitor, the single mother, the orphan child, the quiet souls whose light shines like lanterns in the dark. Because sometimes, just one story carried forward is enough to keep the fire in us from ever going out.